You know, when we think about war, our minds usually jump straight to the battles, right? The fighting. But what happens after the fighting stops and the soldiers stay? Today, we're going to dive into the deep, long-lasting consequences of sustained military occupations. We're exploring what happens when the conflict is over, but the control isn't.
And that right there is a huge question. We tend to think that when the combat ends, the costs stop piling up. But what if that's not the whole story? What if, for the people living under occupation, and believe it or not, even for the occupiers themselves, the really profound costs are just getting started?
All right, so before we go any further, let's get on the same page. What exactly are we talking about here? A sustained military occupation is this long-term state of control. It's not the battle itself, it's the period after, where one group uses force to maintain power over another's land and its people. And that distinction is absolutely crucial, because it changes everything.
So what is the price of that control? And spoiler alert, it's not just about money or soldiers. It's this incredibly complex web of consequences that just ripples through every single part of life. We're going to break down these costs, and we'll start with the ones that hit closest to home.
First up, let's zoom right in on the human impact, the social scars that get left behind. We're talking about how an occupation can just fundamentally tear apart the very fabric of a society, often in ways that can take generations, if ever, to heal.
When we dig into this, a few really big themes pop up again and again. You see a total breakdown of trust between neighbors, deep psychological trauma affecting millions of people, a stunting of education and culture, huge numbers of people forced from their homes, and even a shift in the basic rules of how people live together. Let's unpack a couple of these.
This right here, this gets to the heart of the invisible damage. Just try to imagine it for a second. Living under constant surveillance, with checkpoints, foreign soldiers on every corner. It creates this climate of suspicion where you become afraid to speak freely, even to your neighbors. And those bonds that hold a community together, they just start to dissolve.
And that mental toll? It is staggering. Living under that kind of constant threat, never knowing what might happen next, it creates widespread trauma. Conditions like PTSD, severe anxiety, and depression become rampant. It's like a collective wound that affects the entire psyche of a people.
An occupation doesn't just damage the present, it can literally steal a society's future. You see schools getting damaged or even taken over. Curriculums get rewritten to fit the occupier's narrative. And at the same time, cultural heritage, the very soul of a people, is attacked. Historical sites get damaged. Traditions are suppressed. This is about erasing a past to control a future.
All right, so we've seen the social scars. Now let's switch gears and see how all of that damage spills over into the economy. Because the material drain of an occupation is just as devastating, and it creates this cycle of decay and dependence that, well, it affects everybody.
Now, here's a really key point. This is not a one-way street. The costs aren't just on one side. For the occupied, it's pretty obvious. Their infrastructure is destroyed, their resources are taken, and a crippling dependency is created. But, and this is important, the occupier pays a heavy price too. A massive financial drain, resources pulled away from needs at home, and just huge opportunity costs.
For the people living there, the economy just gets totally twisted out of shape. Normal business and trade get shut down by checkpoints and insecurity. Inflation can skyrocket, making everyday goods impossible to afford. Black markets pop up out of pure necessity. And often, their natural resources are just siphoned off, which prevents any real chance for them to grow on their own.
And this really drives home the cost for the occupier. Every single dollar, every euro, every pound spent maintaining control somewhere else is a dollar that can't be spent on things like hospitals, schools, or fixing roads back home. That's the opportunity cost right there, a hidden but massive price that citizens of the occupying nation end up paying.
Okay, so now let's pull back a bit. Let's zoom out. It's really easy to think of this as just a modern problem, right? But what we're looking at here is a repeating pattern, one with echoes that you can hear across centuries of human history.
And this pattern is incredibly consistent. You can go all the way back to the Roman occupation of Gaul and see resource extraction and cultural erosion. Look at British India and you see systematic economic exploitation. Even the occupations after World War II, which had very different goals, still came with immense costs. From ancient Rome to today, the same devastating patterns just play out again and again.
So, this brings us to the real heart of the matter. So far, we've kind of talked about social costs over here and economic costs over there in separate boxes. But what if that's the wrong way to look at it? What if they aren't separate at all? What if they're actually two parts of the same destructive engine?
And that's the big question, isn't it? And the answer we get is a pretty clear no. They are deeply, fundamentally intertwined, feeding off each other in a truly vicious cycle.
So here's how this nasty cycle works. First, the economic ruin, the poverty, the unemployment, the exploitation that naturally fuels social unrest and resistance. But then, that social breakdown, the lack of trust, the constant instability, makes any kind of real economic recovery impossible. And that creates this feedback loop where each problem just makes the other one worse, dragging the conflict on and on.
So if there's one thing to really get from this, it's this. We can't think of these costs as two separate checklists. They are a single, self-reinforcing, downward spiral. Each one feeds the other, making the crisis deeper and any kind of resolution incredibly difficult. This is the engine that makes this situation so destructive.
Okay, so as we start to wrap this up, let's just quickly recap the big takeaways. First, the real costs of occupation go way, way beyond the battlefield. Second, the burden is heavy for both sides involved. Third, and this is the big one, the social and economic problems are not separate issues. They're a tangled, vicious cycle. And finally, this isn't new. It's a devastating pattern we've seen all throughout history.
And that really leaves us with one last thing to think about. Look, we can analyze the data, we can study the history, we can crunch the economic numbers, but when you strip all of that away, we're pushed to ask a much deeper question. Beyond the balance sheets and the strategies, what is the real, true human price of holding this kind of sustained control over other people? And yeah, that's a question worth sitting with for a while.